We're so delighted to be launching this new book today. Donal Ryan is a novelist and short story writer from Nina, Tipperary. He has won several national and international awards for his fiction and has twice been nominated for the Booker Prize. His work has been adapted for stage and screen and translated into over 20 languages. Donal is a lecturer as well in creative writing at the University of Limerick, and The Queen of Dirt Island is his 7th book. It instantly became a #1 bestseller in Ireland, and we're very excited that it's now available to us in the United States today. We're delighted to welcome him and to listen to his conversation with our own Dr. Kelly Sullivan. Kelly is the Director of Graduate Studies at Ireland House at NYU. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, Donal, for joining us today. It's great to be able to chat with you. And thanks everyone for coming to this Zoom event. So I wanted to follow on Caroline's introduction, and this is your 7th novel, or your 7th, is it your 7th book or your 8th book?
Yeah, 7th book, because there's
7th book. Okay. And I wanted to, it's often your profiles of your books often open with noting that you had 47 rejections for the first novel, which then went on to be longlisted for the Booker Prize, which I find really inspiring. But most of your novels are set in a kind of fictional corner, a fictional/real corner of Tipperary. And I wanted to ask you to open, if you could just tell us a little bit about this place, maybe, and also tell us, I'm very curious about how you sort of construct a fictional world that's also kind of based on a real place. So just bring us into your part of Tipperary.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kelly. It's great to be here, and thank you so much for launching the book for me. It's feel really privileged to be speaking to you guys. But yeah, the place where I set almost all of my fiction is a fictionalized version of North Tipperary, which is a fairly narrow geographical area. But I mean, like most places in the world that are populated, all human life is there. And so, it's a fairly fertile place, I suppose, narratively and socially. For me, emotionally, it's very close. It's physically close. I can see the mountains of my birthplace from the window of my skylight here. It's a place I don't stray too far from in life or in fiction. And the reason it works for me is because it allows me a very ready-made language and lexicon and landscape. And landscape's very important for me. It's, it is a kind of an emotional resonance that really informs most of what I write. But the landscape, is stretched in places and compressed in other places. And most of the place names I use are fictionalized. And it just allows me a very it's kind of an easy, accessible raw material. Because for years and years, for some reason, it makes no sense. But I thought I had to write in a kind of rarefied upper middle class English voice, because I had a silly notion in my head that that's what a novelist was. The novelist was a kind of posh middle class English person. It knows, for a working class guy from North Tipperary, from a rural area, from a Republican background, it made no sense. And the very simple expedient of writing in the demotic voice of the people I loved and the people I know best didn't occur to me until, very late in my attempts at being a writer. When it did, it just made things so much easier, to confine myself physically and politically and emotionally to one area. And I still knew that I could tell any story I wanted pretty much while still remaining in the same place. So it's been fertile ground, thank God.
That's it's wonderful that you can confine yourself in, on the one hand, but at the same time, that kind of opens up the world through your characters to all different kinds of emotional registers and, different backgrounds as well. I mean, you have characters who are not from this part of Tipperary, but who visit there or move there, which allows you to kind of open your novels to the rest of the world in different ways.
Exactly.
You also share characters across some of the novels. Was that something that you had in mind from kind of your early works, or did that did you just sort of say, oh, I had this character who had made a brief appearance in an early work, and then did you start to imagine the backstory of that character later?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the main character in my first novel, John Z. Cunliffe, was, he is a composite character, and he's distilled from people I knew very well in life. And he seemed so real. And, the novel has a sad ending, so John Z can't be a character again. But something of him lingered, and something of the kind of the milieu that he existed in lingered. And so the next novel I wrote, Spinning Heart, which was published first, the characters just really, really came to life, you know, in a really strange way, just had very, very strong, strident voices in my imagination. And particularly the character of Bobby Mahan, who's kind of the main character, even though it's a polyphonic novel. He is kind of the main character, the main focus. And Bobby, I think, has been mentioned at least in nearly every story and novel I've written since. And there's also a police sergeant called Jim Gilday, who literally, I mean, he turns up out of the blue. I'll be writing a scene and all of a sudden I'll know, oh, Jim Gilday obviously has to arrive now. And Jim Gilday just strolls on. It really feels as though Jim Gilday strolls into my mind and he starts pointing and giving orders and telling people what to do. And, you know, and he's a very kind man and he's very capable. He's very experienced. And then he walks off again. His work is done and he's always been a delight. And I actually killed Jim in a novel, in a failed novel that I wrote a few years ago. And I knew, and I'm so glad the novel actually couldn't be published because I couldn't stand to have Jim fictively killed. I felt terrible, you know, and if the novel is ever revised or reworked, I will resurrect Jim. I couldn't do it to him. To be honest, like Jim is such a strong character, I've noticed him appear in other people's novels, not just my own. Just a strange experience, but these things happen. I won't say whose.
We're gonna have to keep an eye out for that when I'm reading contemporary fiction now. So the characters in this novel, it's the Allward women, and you know, this is a novel that's very much focused on the lives of really 4 generations, I suppose, of women. And that's did they appear in earlier novels in any form? I think there's a mention of them, right, in an earlier novel. Am I correct in that?
God, you know, there could be a mention of Eileen Allwright, I think.
Yeah,
somewhere, and you know, I'm not sure where, and I should know in fairness, but I don't tend to look back at my novels too much. But definitely they're friends with the Gladney family, who are the main characters in the previous novel Strange Flowers. So in a way, the Queen of Dirt Island is kind of a follow-on from Strange Flowers because it's in the same small area. And they're neighbors with the family in Strange Flowers, and characters in Strange Flowers become very important characters in the Queen of Dirt Island, and its follow-up actually, which I just finished writing. But again, like the women in the book, their voices just were so loud in my imagination. And I guess because the main character Eileen is drawn very much from the spirit and the voice and the heart of my own mother. And it, strangely, I mean, when I finished the book, I handed a pile of pages to Ma'am, as I always do. And I asked her to read it for me, and she always obliges, and she always kind of insists, actually, because she's afraid something will get into the world that she hasn't, you know, she hasn't given her imprimatur to. And she finished reading it, and she said, "That's very good," but she goes, "Where did you get that one Eileen from?" And she couldn't see. She recognized no part of herself in the main character at all. It was such a strange thing. Like genuinely, she didn't think it was her.
That's fascinating because
Yeah.
she's such a clear character. I mean, you can really sense her in the novel, and I could. You can sense that you had this real developed feel for her. I mean, she's a whole character. She's also a fierce woman, right? She's the kind of woman you want to have on your side. And I'm thinking of one scene in particular. I don't want to give. I know the novel just came out in the US, so I don't want to give away any of the plot or the storyline. But there is a scene. It's a section I think that's just called Forehead, and it involves a kind of fierce defense of her daughter, you know, and it's one of these moments of kind of violence, really, that kind of crops up, but it at the same time it's tempered by, it seems anyway, to be tempered by a profound love for her family and kin. Were the other women in this novel also kind of partially based on people you know? Maybe that's an unfair question, or they kind of...
No, it's not at all. Not at all. I mean, I heard Colm Tóibín once on the radio saying that, you know, we have to be unafraid of pillaging our families' lives and their pains and their joys and everything about them. And we have to have no conscience about it, you know, we have to just do it, you know. And it's Christopher Mill, this is our raw material, you know, our friends, our family, and these are our own experiences. These are the things from which we create fiction. We can parlay anything into a fictional story. And definitely, I mean, I wrote this novel in a kind of mild panic because that novel I mentioned that didn't work out, took 2 years of writing time. and I knew wouldn't be published because it just needed too much work. It needed to be too radically changed, and I hadn't the heart for it. And it was either send back the advance, basically, or write a new novel very quickly because I was going way past my deadline. And so I kind of said a prayer through the skylight here to my ancestors and to God, and genuinely, I feel the prayer was answered. And I don't deserve to have prayers answered. I don't deserve any gifts from the universe, but I do feel as though I was given a gift from the universe. And I heard a ghostly voice saying, "What about a novel about a house full of women?" And this terrible notion occurred to me that the day that my sister was born, she's older than me by about a year and a half. And the day she was born, I always remember my mum saying, "You know, the day Mary was born, your father came into the hospital and he'd been at work and he brought us home, and then he left us at home and he went back to work again, and he went back in a real hurry because, you know, he had so much to do." And you're thinking he could so easily have been killed that day. And I thought, what if he had been killed that day? How would my family have looked? What might have happened? Now, you know, the Eileen situation is different radically to my mother's situation. You know, she does things my mum wouldn't have done, but just that idea of this house being full of women, and then maybe my dad's mother coming to live with them. And I never met her; she died before I was born. But I definitely used some of the essence of what I think I know about her for the character of Nana. And you know, and also Nana was informed by my maternal grandmother, who I knew, you know, and loved dearly. And definitely those voices are coming through, are those spirits. You know, they would claim to be not even 1/10 as profane as Mary and Eileen in the book, but sometimes we don't hear our own expletives, you know, when they're uttered in passion. So I mean, it was a very easy book to write. It did feel like a gift. I mean, I heard my friend and colleague, the novelist and short story writer Mary Costello, say that, you know, she thinks that every writer gets one gift in their career where everything just seems to click into place, and a story just seems to form itself in a very natural and easy way, and things just seem to work. And it just seems to work for that whole 12 weeks. Every writing day was no struggle, and the story just unfolded. And I got to the last scene, and when it's finished, thank God. And I kind of knew it wouldn't need too much editing, you know, it wouldn't need too much redrafting. It was just, it did genuinely feel like a gift.
So am I right in hearing that you wrote the whole novel in 12 weeks then?
12 weeks, yeah. And I think that's not unreasonable. You know, if you can find yourself, and it's hard, if you can find yourself a 12-week space that is pretty clear, you know, because very few writers I find are full-time writers, unless you're prepared to starve and be emaciated and get rickets from malnourishment, you know, or I'll sell a few million copies of your first novel, you won't be a full-time writer. You'll have to carve out writing space. But if you can find 12 free weeks where you haven't got much else to do, you know, you can easily get a novel written. If you've got a good idea, of course.
Yeah, if you have, the gift has come through the skylight. I mean, I have a number of questions, but I want to stick for a minute to the topic of the actual writing of the novel. And yeah. I had, you know, before I knew you wrote this novel in 12 weeks, I was going to ask you about writing during the pandemic, and if that changed anything about the way that you write. You had a novel come out in 2018 and a novel come out in 2020, and then I had assumed that this novel was written kind of over the 2 years of the pandemic, but perhaps actually it was written at the very end, and there was, you know, this other novel. Yeah.
It was written actually in the spring and early summer of 2021, so it would have been kind of after the emergency was kind of finished, and I spent most of the pandemic writing that failed novel, that dark kind of aggressive long thing that just didn't work out. But I'm not sorry that happened, you know. But I think maybe the darkness that pervaded around the world somehow insinuated its way into that novel. You know, and the panic people were feeling, the fear. I think, you know, in the sense of things slipping away from our control, you know, we realized how fragile and how vulnerable we all are, I think, when that happened, and how much we are passive actors when it comes to policy and governments, and what will be allowed, you know, what we'll allow ourselves to obey, you know, the rules we just take on because we think we have to. I think we learned a lot about ourselves as a species, I think, during the pandemic, or not, I don't know. But anyway, I think the darkness really, some of it stemmed from that, you know, that cloistered feeling, that feeling of danger, of the feeling that you had to stay at home, that there was danger without, you know, that the doors needed to remain closed. And so occluded, hidden away things seemed to be easier to express in writing. You know, it seemed to be a kind of safety valve. I think a lot of dark novels were written during the pandemic, to be honest.
Well, it was refreshing to read this and see that the pandemic doesn't come into the novel, even if it does
I know.
another,
Yeah, it's true actually, and I just finished a sequel to this actually, and a direct sequel, and so it's mostly about Pearl, who is Saoirse's daughter, and it's set mostly in America, and it comes right up into pandemic time.
Mm.
And I was thinking, what am I going to do? You know, I can't ignore it. You know, it'd just be silly. People say, sure, look, if it's 2021 or 2020, you know, what about the pandemic? It's going to have to be in there. It really pained me actually to write it in. So I said, I can either just have it as this peripheral, by the way thing, or I can make it an integral part. You know, and so the denouement, it is an integral part. But I'm still not happy about it. You know, it seems to be something that we have to contend with, and there's no way of writing around it really.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I do wonder actually in this novel you have a house full of women, as you just described it, and in a way it is kind of almost cloistered, but it's the opposite of that sense of fear and keeping the world out. It's sort of this sense of safety and comfort and and love, even though there are threats or there are things that happen in the novel that are not comforting. I'm also thinking of the scene again. I don't think I'm giving things away, but they want to build an extension on the house, and they don't trust the men in their lives will do a good job of it. So the women basically build the extension themselves. Do you think that we can stop talking about the pandemic after this, but do you think the pandemic made its way into the novel in that sense of a kind of an enclosed world that's not closed off, though, a place of safety?
God, that's really well observed, Kelly. Yeah, I think so. God, I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but you definitely are right, I think. And it does seem to be kind of an inversion of that kind of fearful sequestering that we experienced during the pandemic, you know, and because I love the idea of how this small house being such a safe place, you know, and being completely filled with love, and there being no threat within at all. All of the threats are from outside. And this place is a complete refuge. And even when, something bad happens and Eileen is in a horrendous temper over how Saoirse has, let her down, she sees, I said, this has to happen. There has to be this huge storm of anger, but it's definitely going to abate, and love is going to take central place again. So I just wanted it to be this light-filled, happy place, because that's the way my childhood home was. I didn't realize that there was darkness in the world. I was completely cosseted and loved to the point of idiocy, where I thought that life was just fun and books and going to, see hurling matches and just enjoyment, Oh, sorry. And I couldn't see any risk, I was well into my teens for realize that the world was a far darker place than I'd been led to believe. Even though I was widely read, I thought, I didn't see any proper correlation between the darkness I could read in books and darkness in life, because life just seemed to be so safe. Really, my eyes were opened gradually. But then I think that state of unawareness is a good place for a writer to be. To be shocked into the awareness of the darkness in life, I think, is good, because you have a kind of visceral reaction to it then, and it becomes easier to sublimate that shock into your art. So I think a lot of writers experience that. You might agree with me, I don't know. For you kind of will have a kind of suffused in a kind of happy, satisfied kind of veil of idiocy, and then you'll witness or experience something negative or dark, and the shock will just change your whole perspective. You'll be so shaken by it that it seems that the cells of your body even change. Every single thing changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, and it kind of gives you almost a narrative arc, right? I mean, there's a change, there's an event and a change that way.
Definitely, yeah, yeah.
I mean, I want to talk about the characters just for another minute or two, and then we can kind of move on. But you put Eileen in a house with her mother-in-law, right? And it's not giving anything away to say that within the first 2 pages of the novel, Saoirse's father does die, killed in a car accident. So it's Eileen and her mother-in-law, which is not necessarily the formula for happiness and joy and light, but they form this this tight family unit that's and some of the best, to me, some of the most fun parts of the novel are the moments in which Eileen and Nana Mary are kind of bantering and yelling at each other and calling each other names, but it's all with a kind of spirit of, I guess, of love, and also of knowing each other so well that they know precisely how they can egg each other on, but still not hurt each other. How did you, I know you derive these characters in part from your people and people in your life, but how did you develop that interaction between a woman and her mother-in-law? Was that, obviously you've created that, and how did that, was that natural? Did you work at it?
No, again, it was all part of this gift that was given through the, from the heavens. And it seemed quite natural. But I was conscious of the fact that Eileen and Mary were very close, but they were of two different but close generations, and they would see the world slightly differently. So there's a point where Mary is amazed that there's a lesbian in the village, and it's this this rumor goes around that two women are having a love affair, and she uses a derogatory term for them, and Eileen gets really angry, and Mary can't understand why Eileen's angry. It's because Eileen has a slightly different political bent to Mary, or a slightly different worldview, and Mary means no harm at all, but Eileen gets really angry at her use of the word, and they have a flare up, and they have a real row, because most of the perceived fights they have, or most of the violent language between them, is used in affection, and it's a very strange thing, and I think almost uniquely Irish thing, that we can deploy expletives in a very affectionate way. And even there's a point where Mary is getting very old, and Eileen is bathing her, and she says something like, "Shut the F up, you silly old bitch, or I'll drown you," and if you just heard those words spoken, you think, God, that lady's in severe danger here. Her carer is threatening to kill her, but that threat of murder is expressed in complete love. And I think it's a lovely thing. And I did base it on the stories that my mum told me about her relationship with my dad's mother when she was young and they were first married, or when they were courting even. Mum was from a big farm a few miles away, and Dad's parents were small caretaker farmers. They didn't own their land. They took care of land for other people, and they lived on a farmhouse on the land. And so they were from two very different social backgrounds, but she absolutely adored her mother-in-law, or future mother-in-law, and she was made to feel so welcome. And she said she just loved that cottage and the open fire, and the fact that my grandmother could seem to make a beautiful meal from almost nothing, and there was always a smell of baking and cooking from the house, and a feeling of absolute acceptance and warmth and love, and how she was, and I thought, if she hadn't died shortly after they were married, they would have had a lifelong relationship. It would have been lovely, and like, she died from Addison's disease, which was undiagnosed, but looking back now, she had all the symptoms of Addison's, but of course there was no cortisol to be given to women at that time. I suppose in that time people just were allowed to die much more with much more glibness than they are now. So it was tragic, but I really wanted to almost kind of make a shrine to a relationship that never happened. That they parted company in life, but still Mum had those few years of knowing her and knowing and seeing her goodness. And I think that experience shaped some of how my mum took on her own problems afterwards and how she lived her life. So it was kind of an homage to that lovely relationship they had.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way. That kind of mirrors the relationship in the novel too. Like, you can sense that closeness. Your description of a certain glibness about death also makes me think of the number of deaths that are in the novel, and there are actually quite a few, but they're very different. Some of them are some happen off screen, so to speak, and some happen in surprising ways, and then others are kind of there's a certain ritual around them, a certain kind of social behavior around them that's more expected. One thing I wanted to ask, maybe sort of in relation to social rituals and social behavior, you've created this world, this very safe, wonderful world, and we do see kind of changes within society in the background, kind of happening in the background and sometimes breaking in. And one thing that was on my mind in reading this novel is there are a few unplanned pregnancies, women who are pregnant without being married, and the mother and baby home revelations for the last couple of decades, they were in my mind when I was reading the novel, but the experience of the women in this world, because of the strong family bonds, is so different than some other women possibly at the same time or in a generation before. Was that, did that come into your mind at all when you were writing, that, you know, these women could have had very different outcomes, you know, had the family been slightly different or slightly less supportive?
Oh, for sure. I mean, in typical Irish fashion, you know, and things being, and it's not just Irish, this happened. This was a state of being around the world. In any state where there was a strong religious hegemony or conservative political hegemony, things like unmarried mothers were occluded and, you know, ignored, and the problems were taken care of, basically. But I mean, for most families where somebody got pregnant outside wedlock, it was just taken care of within the family. Child and mother were taken care of. You know, it was the exception that was sent to a mother and baby home, and of course treated horrendously. And the 80s was, you know, a crux point in Irish society. Things started to really change, but there was still, of course, a pervasive sense of shame and failing and moral failing about being an unmarried parent. I really wanted, and even into the 90s, you know, there wasn't a really strong surge against that kind of patriarchal situation until the late 90s and early 2000s. Not just Ireland. We seem to think in Ireland it was just us, you know. I mean, it was conservative hegemony across the world until fairly recently. But I really wanted to get that across in the novel, that this was a time of huge change, but also that people like Nana, like Mary, who would have been born around the time of the War of Independence, was capable of being open-minded and generous and full of love, you know, and she would feel that pang of regret that, you know, and she will have been so conditioned by her upbringing and by what she was told was morally right, that she will have a negative reaction on the first day, basically. But I knew they'd come true, you know, and I really wanted to show that, how people can so easily just discard those ridiculous conventions around people's behavior and those ridiculous strictures that we apply to ourselves, or that we allow to be applied to ourselves. And I wanted the situation to be triumphant and positive. But also, when it comes to death in the novel, I couldn't ignore it. You know, it describes 4 generations, and it describes the time frame of around 20 years, and so they weren't going to get away with it. Tragedy was going to strike, you know, and I had to be alive to that. And again, you know, I mean, Nicholas Taleb wrote a book about economics called The Black Swan, where he describes this situation where, like, the terrible thing you absolutely didn't expect is the thing that's going to happen next week or next month or next year. You know, black swan will fly in. Nobody ever expects a black swan. And I think, you know, that's the series of horrific events in the book, are those black swans flying in as they fly into all of our lives. Disaster strikes here and there, and there's no way of avoiding it. And there's no way of being properly galvanized. You know, we'll all be shaken to our core here and there in our journey through this existence. And so there was no point in me shying away from that. I think it would have been unrealistic. But still, you know, I always do look back on a book and on every death of a character with regret, and I always think, did I have to do that? You know, did I have to introduce this sadness? Did I have to have this happy thing, this chapter where people laugh and are full of joy and love, and then on the next page have this terrible tragedy happen? But I guess the answer is yes.
Yeah. Likewise, the kind of Celtic tiger and questions around land come into the novel, but in a way that's almost it's part of the plot, and we won't give it away, but it's sort of resolved, or it plays out in a really interesting way, and in a kind of a nice way, I want to say. I mean, it's not land and generational kind of fighting over land plays a role in the novel, and yet the stronger focus seems to be the support and the way that generations can change, and the way that people can change as a response to, you know, new ideas and young people, I suppose. I wanted to ask you actually about the form of the novel too. I know we talked a little bit about writing at the beginning of the conversation, but before you read from it, the novel is sort of divided into very small I guess I'd call them chapters, but they each have a title, a one-word title, and they seem to me to be very uniform in length. Like, I wanted to ask you if you actually did a word count and if they're all sort of within a range of, you know, they're all basically 2 pages. I read a review that called them flash fiction, which I don't know if that's really fair. But was that part of when did that form come into your writing of the novel? Was that there from the start? And did that kind of give you a kind of momentum in the writing?
I actually was. I didn't mind the flash fiction reference actually in that review. I think it was in the New York Times, because I was inspired to a degree by the students on our MA in creative writing at the University of Limerick, because at the start of every autumn semester, we ask the students to write a single piece of flash fiction, just as a kind of palate cleanser and as a kind of a stimulator and a way of just getting into the groove. And the things that people submit are often just astonishing, and the amount of story that can be compressed in a very natural feeling way into such a small in such a small piece of writing is just incredible. And so when I wrote the first scene, it came out at, I think, 503 words. And I thought, if I cut 3 words, it'd be nice and tidy, just as a nice little block of prose to have as the opening for this novel. And then I thought to myself, this is actually a nice modular way of writing a novel. If I can create a novel from 500 word blocks of prose, roughly, it'll be a nice modular way of doing it. And it'll also allow me a very easy way of keeping track of myself and of obviating the risk of digressing too much, of expanding any scene too much, or any character or any piece of dialogue. And as it went on, all of the scenes started to end up at around 500 words. So I said, sure, I might as well just keep them at exactly 500. It'll be, and then it'll be literally modular. It'll be like blocks being built up. And so it became kind of an obsession, but it became very easy. And I thought, actually, after a while, this is actually very natural, because every single day that we live is the exact same length. Every revolution of the earth takes the exact same time. And I thought, some days you get up and you go to work and nothing much happens. Other days, you lose a parent, or your child is born, or you get married, or you meet the love of your life. Some days are huge in content and some days are tiny, but every day is the same length, And I thought as well, if something has to be expanded, I can expand it over 4 or 5 or 3 blocks of prose. And so it just seemed like the right way to do it. And it added to the sense of ease about the whole thing, and the sense of things clicking into place. It felt like an actual, almost a physical click, each block of each unit of story. It didn't feel in any way as though I was forcing it. And it allowed me this nice accordioning of narrative as well. But I saw an Irish critic, and he described it as an odd Oulipian constraint, because apparently the Oulipians were a French school of novel writing who they imposed arbitrary constraints on themselves, like not using certain letters or whatever. And I didn't have any of those pretensions at all in mind. It literally was just a way of getting the story told that really worked. So I was thrilled with it. But I think anything that's formally unusual, is going to be polarizing. It's going to be contentious. You'll have people who hate it and say that they can't read the book because of it. I think I think we do have to write. We have to read with open minds sometimes. Definitely, a writer has to keep a very large part of their focus fixed on the reader and how readable a book is. But I think we also have to read with open minds, be prepared to to encounter variations in form and structure.
Yeah, no, it gives, they're all, mini narratives. And so you have one after another, but they also build to a full narrative arc within the novel itself too. And I mean, it seems to me that you've played with form in that way, even with the Spinning Heart, with the polyphonic form of it. So but it seems like a natural fit for this novel as well.
I'm actually inspired by Evan S. Connell and his novels, Mrs. Bridge, Mr. Bridge, which I love.
Yeah,
absolutely love. Those vignettes that he used to construct those novels, I thought was just breathtaking. I love them.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that connection, but yeah, absolutely. Would you read from the novel parts?
I will do so happily. I'm going to read a chapter of 500 words. Called Proposal. And at this point in the novel, Eileen Aylbert, who is the titular Queen of Dirt Island, is being proposed to by the brother of her late husband. And all of the scenes pretty much are prismed through the eyes of Saoirse, who is Eileen's daughter. At this point in the novel, she's 11 years old. Chris proposed to Mother on an evening in early summer with his working clothes on him, as though he'd been seized suddenly by some amorous impulse, some wild desire that had been lying dormant. He came rushing down from the fields to the village, half-cocked, as Nana said later, though she didn't wholly disapprove of his hastily conceived and poorly executed plan. He stood a long while at the side door, mumbling. Saoirse had never seen a redder face. Mother had stepped back to let him in. She had a cigarette just lit, and she was pulling on it deeply. "Come in, Chris," she said through a cloud of blue smoke. "I won't, Eileen. My boots are covered in muck. I won't drag it in along your clean floor. Clean my arse," said Mother. And Chris laughed, a high chuckle, the way he always did. Chris enjoyed Mother, and she liked him right back. From somewhere, from the ether or the blue heavens or the fumes of new growth or agricultural diesel, he drew courage, and he made his proposal. "Eileen, I was wondering," Saoirse heard him say. "Wondering what, Chris?" "I was wondering if it wouldn't be the best thing for all concerned, if you and me, if I and you, if you and I, if me and you," and then he said it straight, nearly in a shout. "Will you marry me?" Saoirse saw Mother bend forward as though someone had struck her in the stomach, and she grabbed in her two fists the lapels of Chris's overalls, and she pulled him into the kitchen, slamming the door closed in the same movement. Chris's eyes were opened wide in shock. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't to be manhandled off his feet. He straightened himself and put a hand over his face and drew it downwards, as if to reset himself, to regain something of his passive countenance. "What kind of rubbish are you talking, Chris?" But Chris didn't know, it seemed, what kind of rubbish he'd been talking. Anyway, on he ploughed. "We wouldn't have to, you know yourself, be married in the fullness of the word. We'd just, you know yourself, take the bad look off of things. You'd have a bit of company. Yourself and the baby." Baby? Saoirse was 11 years old, and she opened her mouth to protest this slight, but some vague wisdom rose from within her and silenced her. Paddy and Chris, her uncles, called her the baby, and maybe they always would. "I love you dearly, Chris," said Mother, "and I'd be a lucky, lucky woman if I were free to marry you. But I'm still, in my heart and soul, married to your brother, and I will be, I'd say, for all of eternity." Chris said it was okay. He was sorry. And Mother said she was sorry too, and she kissed his cheek. And Chris dragged himself back up the hillside, and he didn't come down again for a long, long time. That's poor old Chris.
Thank you. And we should probably point out that there are kind of two households in the novel, and one is the household with all of the women living in it in that the estate down the hill, and then there's the farm up on the hills.
The old farmstead, yeah.
I think we can open it to questions if those in the audience have questions. You can either put them into the chat if you want, or Mary Elizabeth, I don't know if you've been gathering any up or if people are being shy.
But a little shy it seems, but please feel free to drop questions in the chat. We'll be happy to
or
facilitate
just
that.
You can raise your hand and we can call on you and unmute you if you want to ask a question.
Please feel free to ask any question. Actually, my wife gives out to me because sometimes in Q&As, especially when they're being recorded, I kind of forget myself, and I can't tell a lie because I told a terrible lie about 30 years ago, and I swore I'd never lie again, and so I can't even obfuscate. I can't even pad things out. I have to give completely unvarnished, raw, honest answers to everything I'm asked. And she says sometimes, "Could you not just dress things up a little bit, even for journalists?" But I can't do it. So any question you ask, this is by way of enticement to ask a question, you will receive an absolutely, completely honest truth, because most writers are terrible liars, but I'm not.
I think we've got a question from Bernadette Cullen.
Hi, thank you very much, Donald, for that beautiful reading.
You're welcome, Bernadette.
Really lovely. My question, inasmuch as I felt that I was at the girl's point of view, the young girls, I'm in her mind. Is the narration from third person, is it omniscient? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, it's a great question, Bernadette. It's a great question, and I guess it probably is a close third person, because we're pretty much looking at the world through Saoirse's eyes for most of the novel, but there are moments where I depart. And the departure is a bit of a liberty, to be honest, because there's no narrative payment made for leaving. You know, there are places where I describe things that Saoirse can't see, but I kind of thought I could get away with it, you know. But for the most part, it is a close third person, so it's almost a first person. You know, it's the kind of novel where you read it and you kind of forget afterwards if it was first person or third person, but almost everything is lensed through Saoirse's viewpoint.
Okay.
You know, but I mean, obviously, like things like the first chapter, you know, where her father dies. You know, she's a babe in arms at the time. So, but for the most part, it is pretty much Saoirse, and she's looking at the world. And Saoirse, you know, she exists in a state of wonder. Things happen that she tries to figure out, and she's taking all these things on board, and she's storing things up, you know, because she feels an obligation to do so in one way, and in another way, she revels in the language her mother and grandmother use and the way they speak to each other, and it, you know, it's literally music to her ears. So I wanted everything to kind of come through Saoirse's consciousness. So I guess, yeah.
So at no point, this is a curiosity. I'm with the reading group in Canada doing Ulysses. It's been fabulous. At any point in your novel, do you deliberately go into maybe the mother's voice or another voice, or you restrict yourself to her only?
Yeah, I restricted myself to Saoirse. So even when Eileen is the main actor, even when Eileen is out in front of the house and she's getting in a fight, you know, it's still Saoirse witnessing this. You know,
Okay.
everything that Eileen does can be seen by Saoirse through the window, and everything she says can be heard by Saoirse's ears. So I think really, I mean, the first chapter is the only place where I am that traditional, godly, omniscient, all-knowing, all-seeing figure, that, you know, that remote, mysterious figure who isn't a writer, who is the kind of conveyor of story. And after that, I think for the most part, it is in, you know, we're in Saoirse's head, basically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I think we've got a couple of questions now in the chat, and one of them is about Betsy McKenney says she's just finished reading Queen of Dirt Island and loved it.
Oh, thanks,
When can we expect to see the novel about Pearl? And I would add to that, do you have the title for it yet?
I'm actually I'm really excited about it. But now there's a few things. Normally I feel terrible fear about a novel I've just written, thinking it's not going to fly with the publishers, but I've a feeling they'll like this one, because Pearl is a lovely character. And also my sister made me swear that from now on I will only say good things about my own novels, and I'll back them up to the hilt, and I'll express my joy at being a writer, because she said, you're always kind of saying, it's not that good, you know, I'm not that good a writer. And she said, again, I think it is a very rural Irish thing. No, it's all right, like, you know, but I really enjoyed writing the sequel. And I love the character of Pearl, and Eileen is in it as well, and Saoirse, and there's a ghostly voice from Nana who exists in Pearl's imagination and her memory and her heart. So Nana is still very much alive in the novel, even though she's gone. Shouldn't give that away, really. But anyway, I really enjoyed it, but I'd say it'll be next year before it comes out. All going well.
Do you have a title yet for it?
Yes. Oh, I wonder, should I say it? Yeah, well, at the moment it's called Beautiful Girl. Beautiful Girl.
Great. Well, I'm sure for those of us who've already read Queen of Dirt Island, we're looking forward to it. We have another question in the chat about influence. Jennifer Blum asks, were there certain Irish writers, particularly short story writers, who you felt greatly influenced your writing?
Yeah, definitely. John McGahern was a big influence. Frank O'Connor, Jennifer Johnston, I absolutely love. And Enright, I think, is just one of the most sublime writers in the world. And I think, you know, there's probably an element of every single thing we ever read as writers works its way into our own prose somehow. I mean, we're all using the same 26 letters from the alphabet. We're all using the same words, but how we put them together, I think, you know, is unique for everybody. But everyone's influenced, and I think that everything I've ever read at some point ends up. Roddy Doyle, I absolutely love. I remember reading Petty Clark, Ha Ha Ha, when it won the Booker Prize in 1994, I think, and I just thought, oh my God, that's just perfection. It was just incredible. And I mean, you know, it was a fictionalized memoir, basically. It was, you know, a portrait of Roddy as a young man, you know, and it was just so beautiful and so funny, you know, and this every sentence seemed just so buoyant to lift up from the page in such a beautiful way. I remember thinking to myself, imagine being able to ring home and tell your parents that you've been nominated for the Booker Prize, just nominated even. Imagine then, like having that being able to do that, and like I remember the day that I was nominated, I thought I'd love to ring Roddy Doyle now and tell him that and say, Roddy, I got nominated as well, I didn't win it obviously, but that was a lovely thing. But I think Roddy's fantastic, that, and the joy that Roddy infuses his stories with is just lovely, even when there's just dark times, even when there's disaster on the page, there's a kind of background noise of optimism always.
We have another question from Malachy Fallon. Asking, given the success of Irish films this year, can we expect to see any of your novels in film? And I would add maybe television too, because it seems that you're interconnected, novels in the world would lend itself to TV.
Well, Strange Flowers has been optioned for TV, and 2 novels have been optioned for film. And there was an Irish language film made from the thing about December called Fusca, which means shelter. And I just thought it was phenomenal. It was just so, they said it in Connemara, not Tipperary, but it's in Irish, but it's in a very, very beautiful dialect. And they did a really gorgeous, sympathetic job in it. I just loved it. It was actually put forward as Ireland's entry for the Oscars last year, but didn't get nominated, obviously, which is a shame, I think. But it was a really lovely movie. But you never know what's going to happen, and I tend, some of my novels have been dramatized for stage by Decadent in particular, and they are going on a national tour this summer with From a Low and Quiet Sea, but their production is just breathtaking. It's a different thing altogether to the book, even though they use pretty much the same words, but it just seems it's pure magic to watch an actor bring something you've created to life in the moment.
That's great. There's such a kind of Irish language film, moment right now too.
Colleen Kuhn's work of just genius.
Yeah.
It's just so beautiful. I think it was robbed for the Oscar, to be honest.
Yeah. A couple more questions. Emily Dunlap asks if you're coming back to New York City to teach at Glucksman Ireland House with the Limerick writers, as you did in the past.
Yes, I'll be back, Emily, and you're very welcome to come to Limerick to our MA in creative writing if you want as well. But I think the plan is to be back in New York, I think, next year, hopefully.
Great, that will be great. And then Caroline Hafey has a question. Caroline, do you want to ask your own question? I don't have to speak for you.
Didn't want to interrupt. But no, thank you so much for this, Donal and Kelly. This has been a brilliant conversation. I just wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit more about your writing process,
Sure.
what it looks like in the day-to-day, and how you wrote this novel in just 12 weeks.
Absolutely. My plan was to get up every day and to exercise, to get my head clear, to not drink too much for 12 weeks, it's very important for writers to really keep a lid on that when you're writing, especially, and to write 1,000 words a day that could be edited. And so it kind of worked out pretty okay. And some days I'd write a couple of thousand, and some days maybe just one paragraph. But my aim was to write usable prose every day, and not to have to do too much work to get it into in publishable shape, because I was really aware all the time of the time restrictions and the fact that I'd gone way over my deadline, that I'd been paid in advance, and that really gnaws at your soul when you have money in the bank, or money spent, even worse, for a book that you haven't written yet. It's really, and it's a terrifying thing, and it is a serious motivator, because I can allow myself to be very unmotivated and very unambitious. I have no ambitions about property or money or anything at all. The only ambitions I have are for the sentences I write. And so I do tend not to write more than 3 hours. I can edit for 3 hours as well. So, a full writing day might be 6 hours of actual being at the desk, 3 hours of writing, and maybe 3 hours of editing. I think 3 hours of writing is a lot. I think it's almost, it seems to be kind of a limit. Most writers I meet say that, after 3 hours, that weariness sets in, you start to feel a bit fuzzy in your head and things start to slip a little bit. I think 3 hours is a lovely length of writing time.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the secret to writing a novel is have a really hard deadline that you've passed already and to quit drinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
It's a good start, all right. Yeah, yeah.
I wonder, in relation to that question, we'll probably wrap this up in a minute or two, but did you cut anything from this novel? Do you have any kind of 500 word chunks that are sitting around and that might grow into another novel or a different?
Yes, actually. There is a 500, there's a special edition of the novel that was published by Kenny's Bookshop in Galway. And there is an excise chapter at the end, because in the very first draft of the novel, I went into the future. I went right up as far as Saoirse's death. So she's over 100 years old. And I wrote the scene. I decided, I didn't write the in-between parts, but I wrote the day that Saoirse dies. I can read it if you want.
Sure, that would be great too.
It's called Exequy, and it's in the Kenny's edition of the book. An old man sat beside her bed, holding her hand. His hand was soft and warm, but there was a kind of urgency to his grip, a sense that he might at any moment squeeze her hand, or shake it up and down, or kneel down beside her bed to propose, like a young buck, spunky, pinning all his hopes on a girl. She laughed, though she made hardly a sound. The old man didn't know she was laughing at him, how she'd imagined him just a moment ago, as he might have been with all his years unlived, all his sap still inside his skin. "Who are you?" she asked apologetically. She remembered that this question often upset people, that they sometimes even cried as they answered. That was one of the good things about The Helper. This is my nod to speculative fiction. The Helper is a robot. You couldn't upset her or make her cross or impatient, or make her look like she'd prefer to be anywhere else but here in your dying room. The Helper always just held her gaze solidly, silently, doing that rhythmic slow blink that she did, the one that someone must have thought made her more human. The old man smiled before he answered. Thank God he wasn't going to break down in tears anyway. And just before he told her who he was, she remembered, and she said his name at the exact same time that he said it himself. Joshua. You're my son, Joshua. Of course you are. They both smiled, and he did squeeze her hand after all, laughing, and even shook it up and down a little, in happiness it seemed, at her sudden remembering, welcoming her back. And as she remembered who he was, she remembered who she was herself. She remembered her grandmother and her mother and the house they'd lived in. And she remembered this old man's father. And she remembered the man for whom he was named. And she remembered Honey Bartlett and Father Ambrose and her own ghost of a father who was still playing cards beneath the earth in Yahalara graveyard, just inside the stile by the high step of the wall alley. She remembered them all, and all her long life, every day of it, every wrinkled sheet and cold tiled floor and smoking fire, every pair of eyes, every hand that had ever touched her, every touch of hers, every word spoken. And she wondered again at the enormity of it all, the beauty of it, the relentless beauty of even the ugliest parts of it, the whole universe, a thing that she knew now had dreamt itself into existence. Saoirse looked at the lined, handsome face of her son, and she felt inside herself a deep well of satisfaction, of happiness and love. She closed her eyes against the blazing beauty of his face and tightened her fingers on his dear fingers. And a few moments later, her heart at last stopped beating and she was gone. So that's the future chapter from 2060 something.
I like the little bit of speculative fiction in there. That's great.
Yeah, it was very, very unimaginative now just to have a robot.
Well, thank you so much for this, Donal, and congratulations on the novel.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thanks, guys.